Well, greetings, church family. Today's daily Bible reading had us in Joshua chapters 5 and 6. And in chapter 5, verses 1 through 9, we see the current generation of Israelites at that time getting circumcised before they begin the conquest of the land. Now, if you'll remember, both the Abrahamic covenant, Genesis 17:10 through 12, and the Mosaic covenant in Leviticus 12:3 commanded the Israelite men to be circumcised when they were 8 days old. The first generation of Israelites who left Egypt were circumcised, but of course they died in the wilderness because of their rebellion against the Lord, failing to trust him to give them the promised land when they had reached its southern border. They didn't think that he was going to go through with it. They failed to trust him, and they died in the wilderness. Now, we're not sure why this current generation of Israel had not yet been circumcised. Perhaps the earlier generation had been so rebellious against God that they had consciously rejected that command to circumcise the current generation when they were young. Or perhaps the desert wilderness was simply just not a safe enough location for such an operation. In any case, the people had to exhibit trust in the Lord to undergo this operation and wait to heal up. They had to trust him that no enemies would attack while they were obviously incapacitated. Remember, that was actually how Levi and Simeon had decimated the people of Shechem, who had, of course, violated their sister, Dinah, by having them all get circumcised and then killing them while they were recovering from such an operation. And so here we see the people had to exhibit trust in the Lord. The name Gilgal, we get a little bit of explanation for what it means. It is similar to the Hebrew word for cartwheel or roll. There was a reproach on this generation until they completed this aspect of obeying God, and then that reproach was rolled away from them. Chapter 5, verses 10 through 12, the people rightly observed Passover during the encampment at Gilgal, and we see that the Lord must have timed that out, right? He timed their crossing into the Promised Land to coincide closely with the Passover so that they could remember his wonderful redemption of them from Egypt, even as he brought them to the Promised Land. We also see that the manna lasted throughout the 40 years of wandering in the wilderness, only quitting here when the people had begun to eat from that which was produced in the Promised Land. And in the rest of chapter 5, verses 13 through 15, we get a clear example of the second person of the Trinity, right? God manifesting himself as man before his incarnation as Jesus of Nazareth. Notice that the captain of the host of Yahweh appears as a man in verse 13, and yet the place where he stands, where he appears to Joshua, is holy ground. Verse 15. It's very similar to the burning bush in Exodus 3, where the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses, and yet the ground where this occurred was holy because God himself was there in the bush. Also notice how this commander of the host of Yahweh clearly indicates that he is above Israel, right? Joshua asks, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And he said, "No," right? No to both. Rather, I indeed come now as captain of the host of the Lord. God is far greater than his people, and even though he is the champion of Israel, it is Israel that should be for God's cause. It's not God that is for Israel's cause. Chapter 6, verses 1 through 27, the entire chapter, we get the infamous conquering of the mighty city of Jericho with the most unusual battle plan ever carried out. There's no siege weapons, there's no firing of projectiles, there's just marching around the city once, each for 6 days in a row, with priests preceding the Ark of the Covenant, then circling the city 7 times on the 7th day with 7 priests blowing 7 trumpets, and then the wall would fall down. And this promise is made by God that if the Israelites obey his instruction to a T, then the wall of Jericho would fall flat right in its place, allowing Israel to easily take the city. And it's clearly credited to the Lord in verse 16, where Joshua says, "Shout, for Yahweh has given you the city." He's the one that is giving them this city. This has nothing to do with echoes of shouts and trumpets and some kind of vibration that causes the wall to fall down. No, they just obey God. He's the one that caused the wall, singular, to fall flat. Enough of a wall around Jericho that would allow the armies to go in. Verse 10 shows that the Israelites had to stay silent when they marched around the city instead of shouting or chanting. And see, ancient armies would do those things. They would typically shout and chant and when besieging a city to try to terrify and demoralize the people inside. But here they're supposed to be quiet until that last day, and it's only supposed to be the trumpets and the loud shout, and then the Lord will give them the city. Verses 17 through 19, we see a ban is declared by Joshua. This is going to be important for the next chapter, chapter 7. This ban is declared that the entire city of Jericho is to fall into the hands of the Lord, along with all its belongings, the only exception being Rahab and her household. Every other item of treasure, the spoils of war from Jericho, will belong to the Lord and him alone. And in verses 20 and 21, God keeps his word. Archaeological evidence actually shows that the wall of Jericho fell flat in such a way as to provide an easy incline for the armies of Israel to enter the city. And finally, 22 through 27, we see that Rahab is not only spared, but she was allowed to live in the midst of Israel the rest of her life and presumably go on to worship the Lord as her God. And we also see that no other city is to be built on the ruins of Jericho forevermore. Two big principles we get from these two chapters. One, God puts his great power on display once again, right? He is almighty, and we are to worship him alone. That should be our response as we see his power that gives the city of Jericho to his people. Psalm 24:8 asks the rhetorical question, who is the King of glory? Here's the answer, the Lord. That's Yahweh, strong and mighty. Yahweh, the Lord, mighty in battle. Do you worship this mighty God with all your heart? The other principle, just as the Israelites trusted the Lord to protect them while their soldiers healed from their circumcisions, and as they trusted God's plan of taking down the wall of Jericho, even though the instructions would have been completely different than any other ancient taking of a city, so too you and I must trust the Lord. And that begins with turning from your sin and trusting in him for salvation, trusting in God's ways to save you from his own wrath, which is to come due to your sin, to your sinful nature, and the sins that have come out of your sinful nature. Turning to Christ is trusting him, and then trusting him every day, trusting him with everything about our lives, that we would serve him with all of our hearts and love him. Psalm 37, 3 through 5 tells us this, trust in the Lord and do good. Dwell in the land and cultivate faithfulness. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Commit your way to the Lord. Trust also in him, and he will do it. What wonderful promises, because our desires will be conformed to his desires if we delight in him and if we trust him. And isn't that what we want, to glorify God with our lives? We've seen his mighty power depicted once again in the fall of Jericho here. Let's worship him because of his might and trust him because of who he is and what he does. This has been Joshua chapters 5 and 6, and I hope you have a great day.